The year was 1823, and the forests of Morwen Vale were places few dared to wander. The locals of the nearby village spoke of them in hushed voices, and even the most daring hunters refused to venture too deep among the towering pines. To them, the vale was cursed. They called it the mouth of the forest, a name whispered with trembling lips, as though merely speaking it might awaken something best left forgotten. Jonathan Arkwright, however, was not a man swayed by superstition. He was a historian by trade, but in truth he was a seeker of mysteries, the kind of man whose blood ran hotter the moment he heard a tale others dismissed as folklore. His fascination with the lost cults of Europe had led him across the continent into dusty libraries, monasteries in decay, and archives that smelled of mold and forgotten secrets. Every clue, every rumor, every fragmented scrap of parchment had pointed him here, to these woods, and to the tomb spoken of only in warnings. The journey had taken days. Jonathan's boots were caked with mud, his traveling coat soaked with the morning mist, but still he pressed on, his lantern swinging at his side. His two companions followed closely. Eleanor Whitmore, a young archaeologist with sharper instincts than most men of her field, and Thomas Granger, a broad-shouldered local guide whose unease grew with every step deeper into the vale. "Mr. Arkwright," Thomas muttered, breaking the long silence that had settled among them. "We should not be here. These trees hide more than wolves and foxes. My father told me, and his father before him, the forest swallows the living." Jonathan turned to him with the polite but firm look of a man who had grown tired of repeating himself. "Old wives' tales, Mr. Granger, legends and folklore, thrive in places where men fear what they cannot explain. What is swallowed in these woods are only men's courage." Eleanor, walking just ahead of them, cast Jonathan a quick glance. She was torn, as always, between skepticism and caution. "Still," she said, "the villagers seemed sincere in their warnings. You saw their faces. Some refused to even look at us when you asked about the tomb." "Which," Jonathan said with a spark in his eye, "only proves its existence all the more. Men do not fear shadows unless something once cast them." The mist thickened as they pressed on. Birds had long since ceased their songs. The deeper they walked, the more oppressive the silence became, as if the forest itself waited for them to turn back. It was then that the path widened, revealing stones half buried in moss and soil ancient paving slabs, cracked and uneven, yet unmistakably crafted by human hands. "There," Jonathan said, crouching to brush away a patch of leaves. His fingers revealed carvings etched into the stone, spirals and jagged lines that had weathered the centuries. "Eleanor, note this. These are not natural formations. We are close." Thomas swore under his breath and pulled his cloak tighter, muttering prayers as though the trees themselves were listening. The path wound upward, the forest clearing enough to reveal a structure that loomed ahead. When at last they stood before it, even Jonathan, for all his skepticism, felt his breath catch in his throat. The tomb rose from the earth like a monument of defiance, a temple carved of dark stone and crowned with grotesque figures. Its entrance was an archway choked with vines, flanked by pillars etched with coiling patterns of skulls and serpents. Above the doorway leered a monstrous carving, a great stone skull with fangs bared, roots dangling from its mouth like dried sinew. Above that, a circular relief bore the likeness of a robed figure crowned with rays, its stone eyes staring into the forest with divine cruelty. Eleanor stepped forward, her notebook pressed against her chest. "It's magnificent," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Thomas, however, staggered back, shaking his head furiously. No, this is not a place for God-fearing folk. This is the mouth. My grandmother told me once you pass through, you belong to it." Jonathan's gaze lingered on the grotesque face above the archway. Belong to it or discover it? His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. History does not preserve the timid, Thomas. This is the find of a century. He stepped forward, brushing aside the vines that draped over the entrance. The stone was cold, unnaturally so, and the air that breathed from the darkness within smelled not of dust, but of damp earth and rotting roots. Eleanor hesitated, but curiosity won over fear, and she followed. "Do not go in," Thomas pleaded, clutching his walking stick as though it were a weapon. "Do not. I'll not set foot beyond that threshold. Whatever lies in there was sealed for a reason." Jonathan glanced back at him, his eyes gleaming with conviction. "Then wait here, if you must. But history favors the bold." He pressed his lantern forward into the void. The flame flickered violently, as though protesting. For a heartbeat, the silence deepened so thickly it pressed against their ears. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the stone itself, the massive doors of the tomb shifted. They opened of their own accord. Eleanor gasped and stumbled back, her hand clutching Jonathan's sleeve. Thomas dropped to his knees, crossing himself in frantic whispers. A gust of icy wind spilled out from the darkness, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay and something older, something foul. Jonathan's heart thundered, but his face betrayed no fear, only triumph. "It welcomes us," he said, softly, though his voice shook just slightly. He stepped over the threshold. The tomb swallowed him whole. Eleanor, after a moment's trembling hesitation, followed him in, the glow of their lanterns vanishing into the black. Behind them, Thomas knelt in the dirt, staring at the grotesque skull above the archway, as though it might bite down and devour him too. The forest grew still once more, but the air had changed, and the tomb had awoken. The lantern light cast trembling shadows along the stone walls, as Jonathan and Eleanor stepped deeper into the tomb. The air was cold, heavy with moisture, and carried the faint metallic tang of rust or perhaps blood. Behind them, the groaning. Stone doors creaked back into place, closing with a thunderous finality that reverberated through the halls. Neither Jonathan nor Eleanor touched them, yet the doors sealed as though guided by unseen hands. For a long moment, the two stood in silence. Jonathan tilted his lantern upward, the glow revealing reliefs carved into the walls. Figures twisted, in agony, were etched into the stone, their mouths open in silent screams, arms outstretched as if reaching for salvation that never came. Serpents slithered between them, wrapping around their limbs. At the center of each scene stood a tall figure crowned in radiance, its fanged mouth open wide, as though swallowing the cries of the damned. "This isn't just a tomb," Eleanor whispered, her voice quivering. "It's a temple. Look." At the repetition of the figure, always consuming, always central. "These aren't memorials, they're warnings." Jonathan's eyes glimmered with feverish fascination. He leaned close, brushing moss from one of the carvings. "No, not warnings. Rituals. Look at the detail, the positioning of the figures, the symmetry. These were ceremonies. Sacrifices, perhaps. And this figure," his hand hovered over the crowned entity. It was their god. As they moved down the corridor, the silence deepened. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though dozens of feet walked beside them. The hall remained empty. At times, Eleanor thought she heard a whisper brushing against her ear, soft and indistinct, but when she turned, there was only darkness. After what felt like an eternity of winding passageways, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Stalactites hung from the high ceiling, dripping steadily into puddles that mirrored the dim glow of their lanterns. At the chamber's center lay shattered stone coffins, lids displaced and bones scattered across the floor. Some skeletons still clutched rusted daggers or curled into postures of fear, as though death had found them mid-struggle. Eleanor knelt beside one of the corpses, brushing dust from the blade it held. These weren't grave robbers. They fought here. Against something. Jonathan crouched by another, examining the etchings carved into the coffin lid. Or perhaps they fought for something. Look at this inscriptions. Old dialect. A hybrid of Latin and something older. Silence is the offering. Silence is the seal. As he spoke the words aloud, the air in the chamber seemed to tighten, as though the tomb itself had inhaled. Eleanor shivered. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't say the words here." But Jonathan was too entranced to listen. He traced the symbols with his fingertips, muttering translations under his breath. The keeper of silence. The God who feeds not on flesh, but on sound. Their voices, their screams, their very breath, it was all an offering. A sudden noise broke through the faint scuff of footsteps, deliberate and close. Jonathan swung his lantern around, but the chamber was empty save for the two of them and the restless bones. "Thomas?" Eleanor called, her voice thin. The only reply was silence. They pressed on, deeper into the tomb, the corridors narrowing into suffocating passages. Eleanor sketched frantically in her notebook as they walked, her hands trembling with every stroke. Jonathan deciphered more inscriptions, each one reinforcing the same theme. Silence as sacrifice. Sound as powered out hours seemed to pass before they reached another chamber, this one smaller yet more terrible. At its center rose a colossal stone, idol the same fanged visage, carved above the tomb's entrance. Its hollow eyes stared blankly into the chamber, and its gaping mouth yawned open wide enough for a man to crawl through. Roots dangled from its jaws like strings of decayed flesh, swaying gently, though no breeze touched them. Eleanor's stomach turned. "It's a passageway. It leads deeper down." Jonathan's face was pale, yet his eyes burned with fervor. The idol itself is the gate. The cult built their god not as an image, but as a threshold. Whatever lies below, it is the heart of this tomb. They dared not enter immediately. Instead, they made camp in the chamber's corner, their lanterns dimmed to conserve oil. The silence pressed heavily upon them. Neither could rest, yet both pretended to. Jonathan continued scribbling translations by lantern light, while Eleanor clutched her knees to her chest, listening for the faintest sound. That was when it came again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing against the stone. Eleanor's eyes flew open. She rose, lantern in hand, and swept the light across the chamber. Nothing. The idol's hollow mouth gaped silently back at her dot, then dash movement. A shadow at the edge of her vision, slipping past the carved pillars. She whirled around, but the darkness swallowed it whole. "Jonathan," she whispered urgently, shaking his arm. "There's something here." I saw. A sound cut her off. Not footsteps, not whispers, but a low, guttural breath exhaled from the idol's open jaws. Eleanor's lantern flickered violently, then went out. "Eleanor!" Jonathan cried, scrambling to relight his. Flame flared, filling the chamber once more with a trembling glow. His heart nearly stopped. Eleanor was gone. Her notebook lay abandoned, its pages fluttering in the stale air. Across the stone floor, a trail of smudged red handprints led toward the idol's gaping mouth. Jonathan's chest constricted, a mixture of horror and denial choking him. He stumbled forward, staring at the blood-streaked trail that vanished into the darkness within the stone throat. "Eleanor!" His voice rang against the walls, desperate, furious, trembling. The echo died quickly, swallowed whole by the silence. The idol's mouth waited, its roots swaying like tendrils, eager to pull him inside. Jonathan tightened his grip on the lantern. His jaw clenched, his mind torn between fear and resolve. Somewhere below, Eleanor was alive. She had to be, and the tomb, ancient and patient, had only just begun to feed. Jonathan stood before the idol's gaping mouth, lantern quivering in his grip, his own reflection flickering across the moist stone walls. The bloody handprints had vanished into its darkness, swallowed whole like the whispers before them. For the first time, the certainty that had driven him all his life faltered. The rational historian, the man who dismissed legends as superstition, felt the cold edge of fear carving into his thoughts. But Eleanor was down there, somewhere in that suffocating dark. He could not abandon her. He stepped into the idol's mouth. The stone floor sloped downward at a steep angle, narrow and slick with moss. Roots jutted from the walls, slick and pulsing faintly, as though alive. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew, until each breath condensed before his lips in pale clouds. His lantern's flame sputtered, shrinking as if starved of air. Whispers swirled around him, faint at first, then sharper, as the words brushed against his very ear. He could not decipher them, yet their rhythm was unmistakable. Chants, prayers, or invocations in a language that gnawed at his sanity. He pressed onward, teeth clenched, lantern raised like a weapon. Out at last, the tunnel opened into a vast subterranean chamber. Jonathan froze. The walls here were not smooth stone, but an entanglement of bones and roots, interwoven as though the forest itself had devoured countless bodies and bound them into its veins. The floor was slick with black water, reflecting the eerie shimmer of fungus that glowed faintly in the gloom. And there, kneeling at the chamber's center, was Eleanor. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, her hands resting limply on her knees. Her eyes were wide open, but they did not see him. They stared blankly into the void, unblinking, unresponsive. Her lips moved in a steady rhythm, whispering words that Jonathan could not understand. Yet the cadence chilled him. She was repeating the same invocations carved upon the tomb's walls. Eleanor! Jonathan rushed forward, clutching her shoulders, shaking her. "It's me! Wake up!" Her lips did not cease their murmurs. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, echoing his own voice, mocking his desperation. He pulled her into his arms, shaking her harder. "Eleanor, stop this madness. You must wake." For a moment, her eyes flickered recognition, or perhaps pain, but then they glazed again, and her body went limp-got from the shadows beyond. A figure stirred. Jonathan froze, holding Eleanor close as he turned toward the sound. At first, he thought it was another traveler, another explorer lost to this place. But no, the thing that crawled from the wall was not human. It dragged itself forward on bony limbs entwined with roots, its skull half buried in bark, its eye sockets glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Its jaw hung loose, creaking with each staggered breath. Jonathan staggered back, pulling Eleanor with him. The creature lurched forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though the forest itself animated its corpse. "Stay back." Jonathan roared, though his voice trembled. He swung his lantern wildly, its flame casting mad shadows across the chamber. The skeletal figure did not retreat. More shapes stirred within the walls, their forms half concealed by the root web of bones. The tomb was not empty. It was guarded. Jonathan half dragged, half carried Eleanor across the chamber, his boots splashing through the black water. His mind raced. He remembered the inscriptions. Silence is the offering. Silence is the seal. This was no tomb built to honor the dead. It was a prison, constructed to keep something contained. The cult had not worshipped a god. They had chained one. He stumbled into a narrow corridor that wound deeper still, the guardian slithering close. Behind, the walls closed around him, the whispers intensifying until they vibrated through his very bones. Eleanor stirred in his arms, her murmurs rising louder, as though echoing the chants of the unseen. "Jonathan," she whispered suddenly, her voice not her own. "It waits. It hungers. It must be fed. He shook her violently. Eleanor, don't speak like that. You're stronger than this. Fight it. Her eyes rolled back, her voice becoming a chorus of many, layered and discordant. Every century, every cycle. The seal weakens. A sacrifice must be made. Jonathan's breath came ragged, his throat dry. Sacrifice. That word returned again. And again in the inscriptions. Was that the cult's true purpose? Not to glorify their god, but to imprison it through blood. The corridor widened suddenly, opening into a colossal sacrificial hall. Jonathan's lantern revealed towering pillars, carved with spirals of skulls, their empty sockets staring down like witnesses to his trespass. At the far end stood an altar, cracked and darkened with centuries of stains. Dot above it loomed a massive stone idol larger than any before. Its fanged mouth gaped open, its body entwined with roots that pulsed faintly. As though alive, the ground trembled. Jonathan stumbled, barely keeping Eleanor upright. The whispers swelled into a deafening chorus, though still not a single sound carried through the tomb other than their voices. The guardians pressed closer, their skeletal forms swarming at the edges of the hall. Then, with a groan that shook the very pillars, the idol cracked. Roots snapped, stone shattered, and from within its core, something began to emerge. Jonathan's lantern flickered violently, its flame shrinking to a pinprick. The Keeper of Silence was awakening Dot. It was no statue, no mere carving. It was a colossal, skeletal form, wrapped in sinewy vines that writhed as though alive. Its hollow eyes burned with a cold, unearthly glow. Its jaw unhinged wider than any natural skull, lined with roots that dripped like tendrils of flesh. The air around it bent, the silence so absolute that Jonathan felt his own heartbeat vanish, his breath stolen before it left his lips. Eleanor stirred in his arms, her head tilting upward toward the towering figure. Her voice, though soft, carried. In the silence like thunder, the Keeper of Silence awakens. Jonathan's knees buckled as the massive creature dragged itself free of the idol's remnants. Its shadow fell across the sacrificial hall, vast and suffocating. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Arkwright wished he had heeded the superstitions of peasants. The seal had broken. A god was free. Asterisk. The Keeper of Silence tore itself free of the idol's shell with a soundless shriek, its immense skeletal frame draped in writhing roots that pulsed like veins. The sheer presence of it pressed against Jonathan's chest, stealing the air from his lungs. The silence was crushing, deafening in its absence of sound. He could not hear the shatter of stone as the idol collapsed, nor the rush of his own heartbeat. Even his ragged breaths fell mute as they left his lips. Jonathan staggered backward, clutching Eleanor to him as though she were an anchor to sanity. The guardians, skeletal husks entwined with roots, crowded at the edges of the chamber, their glowing sockets watching in reverence. This was their god, their jailer, their hunger incarnate. The Keeper's hollow gaze fell upon them. Its jaw opened. Wider, impossibly wide, a black void stretching into nothingness. From it poured a silence so thick Jonathan felt his bones tremble, as though the very sound of his existence was being devoured. Eleanor stirred in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, filled not with recognition, but with an unnatural light. Her lips moving, though no sound escaped. She pointed weakly to the altar. Her voice filled his mind, though it never touched his ears. The sacrifice. The seal. One must be given, or all will be taken. Jonathan's mind reeled. The inscriptions, the whispers, the endless repetition of silence as offering, silence as seal. The cult had not served their god. They had bound it, imprisoning it beneath the forest through blood and silence. Each century, a new life was demanded to reinforce the chains. Thomas stumbled into the chamber then, his face ashen with terror. He had followed at last, his courage overcome by dread curiosity. His eyes bulged at the sight of the towering keeper. He dropped to his knees, crossing himself feverishly. No, 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 this is death itself. We must flee. Jonathan, forget. The girl, leave her. Leave her. Jonathan rounded on him, fury blazing in his eyes. Leave her? She is no offering. No one is. Thomas scrambled toward the archway, but the guardians stirred, blocking his path. One lashed out with root tangled, claws impaling him through the chest. His scream was silent, his mouth stretched wide in agony, though not a sound left his lips. The guardians dragged him into the walls, swallowing him into the root web with grotesque slowness. Jonathan shut his eyes, bile rising in his throat. One life already taken, but it was not enough. The keeper loomed closer, its tendrils dragging across the floor, cracking stone beneath their weight. The silence pressed heavier, suffocating as though the entire world held its breath. Eleanor clutched Jonathan's arm, her lips trembling. Her voice came again, faint but insistent, in his mind. If no one gives themselves, it will break free. It will silence the world. Jonathan's heart pounded, though he could not hear it. He looked to the altar darkened by centuries of sacrifice, its grooves carved deep to channel blood. He looked to Eleanor, weak, pale, her strength waning from the whispers that had ensnared her. He knew then what choice remained. He kissed her forehead gently, lingering for one last moment. Forgive me, he mouthed, though no sound escaped. Live, carry the truth. Before she could stop him, he tore himself from her grasp and mounted the altar. The cold stone bit into his palms as he spread his arms wide, staring into the gaping void of the keeper's maw. The god shuddered, its roots twitching with anticipation. Eleanor crawled toward him, tears streaming down her cheeks, her voice breaking. Into his mind. No, Jonathan, no. But Jonathan only smiled faintly, a weary smile of a man who had spent his life chasing shadows and had at last found purpose in surrendering to one. The keeper's tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his body, coiling tight until his ribs cracked under the pressure. They lifted him high, suspending him above the altar. His lantern fell and shattered, plunging the chamber into a hellish glow of the idol's burning eyes. The roots pierced his skin, burrowing deep, drinking of his blood and life. He convulsed, his jaw opening in a scream that no ear could ever hear. His voice was stolen, devoured, consumed utterly. And then the silence shifted. It deepened, but not with hunger, with satisfaction. The tremor ceased. The guardians bowed their heads, retreating into the walls once more. The keeper's glow dimmed, its colossal form shuddering as the roots withdrew back into its skeletal frame. Slowly, inexorably, it slumped forward, its jaw closing, the void within fading to darkness. The chains had been reforged. Jonathan's body, drained and hollow, fell limp upon the altar. His eyes, once bright with feverish curiosity, now stared sightless into the void. The tomb had taken its due. Eleanor crawled to his side, sobbing silently, her cries swallowed by the eternal hush. She clutched his hand, cold and still, pressing it to her cheek. For a moment she could not breathe, could not move, could not fathom continuing alone. But then the tremors began anew, this time from the walls, collapsing as the tomb sealed itself once more. Cracks split the pillars, dust and stone raining down. Eleanor staggered to her feet, forcing herself to move. Jonathan had given himself to the tomb so she might live. To waste that gift would be to betray him. She ran, stumbling through the labyrinth, clutching her notebook to her chest as though it were Jonathan's final words. The corridor seemed endless, but at last the faint outline of the idol's throat appeared ahead. She scrambled upward, her lungs burning though no sound. marked her exertion. At last, she burst into the open air. The forest greeted her with a rush of sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of wind. It was overwhelming, painful, after the suffocating silence below. She collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping, clutching at the earth as though to assure herself she was truly free. Behind her, the tomb's doors groaned shut once more. The grotesque skull above the entrance dripped fresh black roots, glistening as though fed by new blood. Its stone eyes seemed to glare with renewed hunger, but its mouth was sealed again for now. Eleanor rose unsteadily, her legs trembling. She looked back one final time. The forest was quiet, but not with peace. It was the quiet of something sated, something waiting. She pressed her notebook to her chest. Jonathan's sacrifice would not be in vain, but neither could the truth ever be told. The world was not ready. Perhaps it would never be ready. She turned and stumbled down the path toward the village, the mist swallowing her figure. Behind her, the tomb settled into silence once more, patient in its hunger, biding its time till another century passed. And as the wind swept through the trees, it carried not birdsong, not whispers, but the hollow echo of silence, an eternal reminder that the forest's mouth was never truly closed. Asterisk.